It's the 2022 World Cup. It's the squad update for Germany. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I am Kevin and today we'll be updating Germany's squad for the 2022 World Cup. The final squads have been out for a little while now, but here is the promised update mediacast where we look at the selections, the non-selections, the surprises and the injury updates that we made in our full team podcast when we went through all the candidates. We gave career information and participation information on each of the possible candidates for Germany there and predicted their likelihood of making the squad. So today we'll check how accurate our predictions were and we will update recent games. Check the show notes for links to that full player mediacast as well as the group mediacast where we took a close look at the teams. Germany's history and their chances in this tournament. All right, well, let's get started. Oh, by the way, if you want a short version, jump to the end. We give a summary of a bunch of things, and we also reassess our predictions of final starters. So you can check into injuries quickly there. So let's begin. I am wearing a German shirt. Thankfully, I actually am on topic this time, although I think this is a lesser used shirt. But anyway, I got to go with what I have. Let's take a look at the formations. So we're really focused on the September or the recent games here, but we're going to kind of give an overview of everything since the Euro Cup. So the full-length podcast actually covered from after the Euro Cup to the June 2022 games. And they played 3 games since there. So 2 Nations League games in September and then a friendly just before the Cup. So we'll look at the formations there. We'll begin with the Euro Cup here, and we'll see that after the Euro Cup they had a manager change, so things did change. We can see they went with a 3-4-2-1 in the Euro Cup, so 3 at the back, but after the manager change it's mostly 4 at the back. They did try that 3-4-2-1 3 times, or 4 times I should say, but seemed to go back to a 4-2-3-1 for all but one of the World Cup qualifying games and for 4 of the 6 Nations League games. So for the 2 September games and for the friendly, it was a 4-2-3-1. So it looks like that's what they're going to bring into the Cup. By the way, the games they played there in September were at home to Hungary, and that was a 0-1 loss, the first September game, and the second one was a 3-3 draw away in England. And then on November 16th, they traveled to Oman to kind of acclimatize themselves, I suppose, and they played Oman and they won 1-0. The score not mattering there to our purposes as much as the formations. So 4-2-3-1 in each of the formations. And I'll also say that the first September game looked a lot like what we expect to be their starting lineup. But the second game in September and the November game was a bit more experimental. It did use players that they ultimately brought to the squad, so they weren't trying out new players. Rather, they were putting on a few substitutes and trying out, for example, players in different positions, experimenting like that. And by the way, they finished 3rd in their Nations League Group A, behind Italy and Hungary, but ahead of England. So not a great start for the new manager. But there we have it. Okay, let us move on to the squad then, and we will talk about that manager. Outgoing manager is Joachim Löw, and we won't talk much about him, but we will talk about Hansi Flick, and we'll regard him as having made the squad here. Hansi Flick has been their manager then since after the Euro Cup. after the Euro Cup. He's filling big boots because Joachim Löw was the manager of Germany for 15 years, from 2006 to 2021. And so Hansi Flick coming in there after the the 2020 Euro Cup, it's called, but it was in June 2021, and finishing out their World Cup qualifying games, and also playing Nations League games in June and September. Okay, let's move on to the players. So what we're going to do here is kind of go through the candidates that we came up with in the full player podcast, as well as their likelihood of reaching the squad. And we can't justify here why we put them where we did. We did that in the full-length player podcast, but we're just going to give the names here. So if you disagree with some of our decisions, you can go back and see why we made them in the full-length player podcast. Anyway, we're going to go through the candidates and their likelihood of reaching the squad. And secondly, we'll name who made the squad. And there was no preliminary squad for Germany. They just published a final squad, and then we're going to just review the position with a particular eye to what happened in the position for the September friendlies and the November friendly. We won't talk about who we think are going to be starters at this point, but we'll do that at the end of the media cast here. Okay, so for goalkeepers, we have definite candidate Manuel Neuer, likely candidate Kevin Trapp, possible candidates Marc-Andre ter Stegen and Oliver Baumann, and seems to be off the squad Bernd Leno. So again, people may wonder why we have ter Stegen just as a possible candidate, but you'd have to see our reasons in the full-length podcast. In terms of who made it, Manuel Neuer was selected, Kevin Trapp also selected, and Marc-Andre ter Stegen selected for the final squad there, but Oliver Baumann and Bernd Leno not selected. Okay, well, let's look at the position. Yes, we did, again, I say up till June 2022. So it was Neuer for 10 of those games, and ter Stegen stepping in for 3 of them. In September, ter Stegen started both of the September friendlies, so finished out the Nations League games for them, but Neuer came in for the November friendly. So we'll talk about at the end of the podcast, end of the media cast, whether that changes our opinion on who we think the starter will be. Okay, moving on to defenders. In central defense, we have Niklas Süle and Thilo Kehrer as definite candidates, Antonio Rudiger and Nico Schlotterbeck as likely candidates, and possible candidates we have Matthias Ginter and Jonathan Tah, and seems to be off the squad we have Matt Hummels and Robin Koch. I don't think he's on the list there, so I'll add him, Robin Koch, actually. And we have a new candidate added to the list that they added at the very end in the squad selection. So we'll tell you who that is right away here. But let's go through and well, I'll tell you right away. Why keep you in suspense? It is Armel Bella-Kotchap. Armel Bella-Kotchap. And since he wasn't on our radar in the full player podcast, we'll introduce him here. He got his first appearance on the bench in September 2022, and he didn't start either of their remaining games there, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for the other. I forgot to check whether he was on the squad for the November game. And I see that he was, and he was subbed in 34 minutes in. So so that would make it, well, that would be his only cap. He's 21 years old and he plays for Southampton in England. So Armel Bella-Kotchap, a last-minute addition to the squad. Let's go back over the players there. So we have Niklas Süle selected, and Thilo Kehrer also selected. Antonio Rudiger made the final squad also, as well as Nico Schlotterbeck. And among the two possible candidates, Matthias Ginter did make it, but Jonathan Tah did not. And neither of the players who seemed to be off the squad made it. Mats Hummels and Robin Koch. There. Okay, so 6 candidates as central defenders, and we'll kind of summarize the position over the last while. So basically, Rudiger and Sula seem to be the most common starters in the period we looked at, but there was a lot of rotation, players coming in and out, and that proved so in the recent friendlies. There were 3 different pairings in the recent friendlies. In other words, all of the players except for Bella Kotchap, were used as starters. Only Sula started twice. So that made it a bit difficult for us to predict who's going to be the starter. But we'll get to that at the end of this media cast. Okay, let's go to left backs then. And we have a definite candidate in David Raum. And then possible but unlikely candidates in Robin Gosens and Christian Gunter. And then one player who seems to be off the squad, Marcel Holstenberg. Excuse me, I had to cough there. Okay, so David Raum, the definite candidate, was selected. And Robin Gosens was not, but Christian Gunter did, which is a bit of a surprise because we had him as possible but unlikely. And Marcel Holstenberg was not selected. So let's review the position. It's only used in the 4-man defense. So, well, recently that's most of the time, but about a third of the time during the period we're talking about, it was not used. It was a 3-man defense, in which case there's a left and right midfield winger, I should say, and often it is the right and left backs pushing up to that position. We'll talk about that soon. But anyway, regardless of which position it was, left back or left winger, Raum was increasingly used in the period that we were looking at, and then in the recent games he played all 3, which suggests that the position is kind of his. Okay, I don't know how to finish that sentence. Okay, let's look at right backs. And here we actually have Joshua Kimmich, but we're going to move him to defensive midfielder because during this period he played as a defensive midfielder. He kind of switched his position. So we'll remove him from the right backs list. And so we have definite candidate Jonas Hoffman, who actually we moved in the main podcast, the Full Player podcast. He is actually coded as a central midfielder, but we moved him to right backs because that's primarily where he plays. Interestingly, he actually moves up to play as a right attacking midfielder sometimes also. Anyway, moving on, we have likely candidate Lucas Klosterman, and we have possible candidate Benjamin Heinrichs. And among those players, Joseph Hoffman made the squad, and Lucas Klosterman also made the squad, but Benjamin Heinrichs did not. So let's summarize the position. It's a bit more complex than the left back. Once again, it's only used in that 4-man defense, so about 2/3 of the time, but we expect them to do that in the cup. And again, after several players being tried out in the position, it was mostly Hoffman ending up in the spot. And Klosterman did get 2 starts in the position. And I think the central defender Kehrer also started once during that period. In the September games, the Nations League games, it was Klosterman in the first game, and then central defender Kehrer in the second, and then Hoffman returned to the position in the third game. But actually, Hoffman was on the field for the 2 September games, but as a right attacking midfielder. Okay, we move on to the midfield, and we start with defensive midfielders. So we have Joshua Kimmich, who we moved. I think he is coded uh, as a defensive midfielder now, having played for quite a while in that position. We also have possible candidate Anton Stach and possible but unlikely Julian Weigl, and seems to be off the squad Emre Can. And in fact, none of those last three was selected for the squad. So Anton Stach, Julian Weigl, and Emre Can not selected for this World Cup. But Joshua Kimmich, no surprise, was selected. So he's the only defensive midfielder on the list here. But that position often mixes with central midfield. So we will do those players before summarizing the position. And there we have a definite candidate in Ilkay Gundogan. And we're going to actually move Leon Goretzka. He's coded as a left midfielder, and we're going to move him to this position because he is playing as a central midfielder when he starts. So Leon Goretzka. And Florian Neuhaus, which I have a comment on. And possible, but Florian Neuhaus is a possible candidate, by the way. Possible but unlikely Maximilian Arnold, and retired Tony Cruz. So a big player in this position, but now retired. So we'll remove Tony Cruz from the list, as well as Maximilian Arnold, who was not selected for the squad. Florian Neuhaus was injured. Partial damage to his cruciate ligament, and that injury was picked up in mid-September, and he has been out of action since. And in fact, his return date is expected to be in January 2023. Now, we had him as a possible candidate, so it's difficult to say whether he would have been selected. He was kind of on the edge, but regardless, the injury makes it left him off the squad, whether it was the injury alone or a selection decision. Leon Goretzka, however, did make it, and I've already given away on the visual at least that Ilkay Gundogan did make it also. So these two candidates, the only ones left there in the central midfield. So let's take a look at these three: Joshua Kimmich, Ilkay Gundogan, and Leon Goretzka, and the position they play in. So again, in the formation they use, there's always two central midfielder, whether it's that three-man defense or the four-man defense. So we're looking at two players here. And wow, various candidates were tried out under the new manager. It was actually a bit difficult to negotiate, but I boiled it down to, or actually the situation itself seemed to boil down to Kimmich and Gundogan, with Goretzka sometimes moving back to replace Gundogan there. But actually, Goretzka was in the position himself for the first part of the period. So anyway, that situation was kind of, the recent situation was mirrored in recent games, with Kimmich and Gundogan starting both of the September friendlies, and then Goretzka coming back to replace Gundogan in the November friendly. So there we have it. So we'll come back to that when we talk about starters, but we move on to left wingers. And the only player coded as a left winger here is Marco Reus. And I'll deal with right wingers at the same time because there are no candidates as right wingers. So let's, well, first of all, I'll tell you that Marco Reus did not make the squad. He's actually injured, but we don't think that's the reason he didn't make the squad. He's out with ankle problems. Since the beginning of October, although he did kind of come back for a couple of games there, but it seems to be kind of a persistent problem. But he hadn't played for Germany for a year. He had other injuries also, but sometimes he was fit and just not selected. So we don't think the injury is the reason he wasn't selected. Okay, anyway, moving on, we'll just talk a little bit about the positions of left and right winger. So with Royce not selected, we have no candidates as left and right wingers. So what do we do? Well, they did use that position in the 3-4-2-1 formation, and what they did was they moved up the right backs and the left back to the winger position. So they did that every time except for once, where attacking midfielder Julian Draxler stepped in as the right winger once. So we have kind of covered the position by talking about the left backs and the right backs. So let's move on to left midfielders, and we're going to rearrange things a little bit here. We're going to move right midfielder Leroy Sané to the left midfielder position, because that's where he's been playing, even though he's coded as a right winger. And we're going to move forward Serge Gnabry to the right midfielder position. He's coded as a likely candidate there. Okay, now we're set up to talk about these players. So for left midfielders, we have definite candidate Leroy Sané. We moved out Leon Goretzka, although he's coded as a left midfielder. We talked about him as a central midfielder. And we also have Julian Brandt as a possible candidate. So actually both of those players, Leroy Sané and Julian Brandt, made it to the final squad. And let's talk about the left midfielder position. So it is really a left attacking midfielder. And in our discussion in the full podcast, we went through in more detail with the several players who kind of came in and out, until it kind of ended up that Sané seems the first choice, and Musiala comes into the position sometimes too. So we'll look at Musiala a little bit later. But we're going to say kind of Leroy Sané over here. Julian Brandt actually hasn't started any of their games in the period we're talking about to June 2022, but he nevertheless was selected for the squad and sometimes comes in as a substitute. Okay, so same position on the right side, except it is less settled on the right, but I'm jumping ahead of myself here. I'll talk about the candidates before talking about the positions. So we have a definite candidate in Thomas Müller, and a likely candidate in Serge Gnabry, and a possible but unlikely candidate in Riddle Baku. And I highlighted the players who made it unwittingly first, but anyway, Thomas Müller and Serge Gnabry did make the final squad, while Riddle Baku did not. Okay, now I'll talk about the position. So as I said, here too, they had various candidates coming in and out, and things didn't settle as much as they did on the left towards the end there. So Müller sometimes plays there, but he also plays other positions. Gnabry also plays there, but I think recently he's been playing central attacking midfield more. And yes, recent friendlies continue to show how unstable the situation is. I shouldn't say recent friendlies, because two of them were Nations League games. So those recent games are also kind of unstable. Gnabry in the first September friendly, and then defensive midfielder Jonas Hoffmann moving up to play it twice. We have Hoffmann as a right back now, or we talked about him there, in that position. He came up to play the position twice, so it's a bit confusing, the right attacking midfielder, kind of several players moving into the position, and I've simplified it beyond that to make it less complex. Anyway, Müller and Gnabry, the kind of nominal right midfielders. Okay, let's move on to attacking midfielders now. And the candidates we have here are Kai Havertz and Jamal Musiala as definite candidates, and possible candidate Julian Draxler. Okay, so Kai Havertz and Jamal Musiala both selected for the squad, but Julian Draxler not selected. Okay, and we'll talk about this position. So, yes, in the recent formation they've been using, the 4-2-3-1, there is a central attacking midfielder. And in the first half of the period we looked at, that would be after the Euro Cup, so the World Cup qualifiers, Marco Reus played about half the games. However, we saw that he wasn't selected for the team. So it seems that Muller and Havertz are the two main starters now. And in the recent games, each one of them played one of the September friendlies. And in November, it was Musiala starting as the central attacking midfielder. So a bit unsettled there, but it is kind of the same players rotating through the position. And so we'll talk about who we think is going to be the starter at the end. All right, let's finish with forwards here. And we have definite candidate Timo Werner and likely candidate Lucas Mecha and possible candidate Karim Adeyemi. We did move Serge Gnabry, who is coded as a forward primarily. We moved him to the right midfield to talk about him there. So, yes, now we have news on Timo Werner. He is injured, so he won't be part of the cup. I'll tell you more about that soon. And what's more, Lucas Mecha is also injured. So the possible candidate Karim Adeyemi was selected, maybe because those players were injured, I'm not sure. And they've also added a new candidate in Youssoufa Moukoko. Youssoufa Moukoko. So I'll tell you a little bit about Moukoko here. He was born in Cameroon, but kind of grew up in Germany and played for Germany youth teams, the under-16 and under-20 and 21 teams. In terms of his appearances, he had been new to the squad, never appearing for the national team before being named to the preliminary squad. And he plays for Borussia Dortmund in Germany and is just 18 years old. So Youssoufa Moukoko, again, probably selected because the main forwards are out. So let's go back and look at that. Timo Werner had a ligament tear, an injury which he picked up in early November, and he is not expected to return until January 2023. So given the few number of forwards they have, that's a pretty big loss. And then Lucas Nemecha picked up an injury in mid-November, so I believe that was after Werner. And that's a patella injury. That's patella is kind of the backside of the knee. So his return date is unknown, but he too is out of the cup. So a bit of a disaster on the front line for Germany right at the end. Both of those injuries very recent. Okay, well, let's talk about the position. So generally it was Werner as the starter. But he was sometimes replaced by the attacking midfielders Havertz and Müller. So Werner, in terms of the recent games, Werner and Havertz each started one of the September Nations League games. Werner was not injured at that time. However, with Werner out in November, as well as substitute Nemecha, they turned to newcomer Moukoko, so he started as a centre forward in the November friendly. So we'll talk about whether that makes him a starter at the end or towards the end of the podcast. So interesting developments there, but kind of worrisome for Germany. Okay, let's move on to talk about some statistics. So we'll begin with the average age of the squad. We did these statistics for a wider group in the full-length podcast, but now we're focused on the 26 players they have. And the average age is 26.8 years old. And it's turning out that that's actually slightly younger than the average, slightly younger than most teams. The average is 27 years old. So they have 2 players who are 33 or older and 5 players who are 32 or younger. So we'll take a quick look at that with this graphic here. And the older players are Manuel Neuer at 36 and Thomas Müller at 32. And beyond that, they have 33 is Thomas Müller. And beyond that, they have 5 players who are in their 30s, which is not a problem. But once players start getting beyond 33, especially outfield players, they're often kind of losing a step. Not always, though. At the other end, the young players, there are 5 who are younger than 22, but none of them are kind of starters for the squad. So the youngest starter would be Kai Havertz at 23, David Rome at 24. Those are the 2 younger ones. After that, we jump up to 26 years old. So that's not particularly young as a soccer player. Okay, moving on to average caps. If they're a little bit younger, we would expect them to be slightly lower than average for caps. But in fact, they're slightly above with 35.2 caps per player. And the average is 34.2. So, they kind of get a bit of benefit of youth and experience there. But nothing kind of outstanding, nothing much to talk about there. A little bit more to talk about in terms of goals, though. The players among them have 152 goals. And in this statistics we've created, it works out to 16.6% in total goals per cap. Total goals per cap. So the benefit of this statistic is it's not that meaningful in itself, but it is good for comparing with other teams. So the average is 13.5%. So 16.6 is a healthy average there. And there are teams that score more. Brazil is high, France is high, but Germany is among the highest scoring teams there. And we'll break that down a little bit more by looking at some of their percentages. We actually did do this in the full player podcast too, so we won't dwell on it. Most impressive is Serge Gnabry. Okay, we have a couple of players here in the list that aren't actually on the squad. So I wonder what I'm looking at here. But anyway, Serge Gnabry, 20 goals in 36 games. That's very impressive, 55.6%. A forward does well if he has an average of 40%, a scoring ratio of 40%. So Thomas Müller is pretty close to that at 37%. That's 44 goals in 118 games. And they have several players kind of in the 30% level, Kai Havertz and even Leon Goretzka, although he has kind of moved into a more defensive role. Let's move on to some summaries. So we're going to start with notable non-selections on the squad. So actually, there are really no notable non-selections from our point of view. So here we would include candidates that we had as definite or likely that were not selected, and there were none of those. So all of the players we coded as definite and likely were actually selected. Surprise inclusions, though, there was one candidate who we didn't expect to be selected. We had him as possible but unlikely, but he did make the squad, and that was left back Christian Gunter. Okay, and then new candidates. We had 2 new candidates added to the squad. One was central defender Armel Bella-Kotcha, and 2 was an attempt to make up I suppose, for their injured forwards. Yusufa Mukoko added to the squad on the kind of at the last minute there. And we'll give an update on some injuries. So some of these we talked about in the previous podcast. So I thought I should update them. So Leroy Sané, we had said that he, no, we didn't say this. This actually happened between these two podcasts, but he picked up a torn muscle fiber injury in late October, which was worrying for Germany. But it turned out the injury only lasted for 2 weeks, and he was back in action by early November. So fortunately, they have his services available to them. We did talk about Lucas Klosterman in the previous podcast, and we had reported that he was out with a ruptured ligament from mid-August with an unknown return date at that time. But he returned to action with this club just in time to be selected here. He returned on November 9th, although he was only on the bench for the last 2 games that his club played. So we got to wonder whether he's really fit to play in the World Cup. I'd be surprised if he is selected for the first game, and they'll probably try to give him a bit of time to build up his fitness. Anyway, Lucas Klosterman was selected for the squad, so they know about that injury. They selected him even knowing about that injury, is what I mean. Okay, and then we have a few players who were dropped due to injury, and Timo Werner being the biggest of them, of course, a big loss to them. But another forward probably would have been a substitute, but Lucas Mecha, and so really kind of getting ravaged on the forward line there. And finally, Florian Neuhaus. And I'm not sure we talked about him in the above, so I'll just repeat or tell you here. He had an injury. Yes, I did say he was not expected back until January 2023. Anyway, so they lost the services of all 3 of those players. And yes, but nothing actually compared to the injuries France has undergone. And then we have a category for players who are injured but not a strong candidate, and I suppose we would put Marco Reus in that category there. Okay, let's finish by talking, not quite finish, but go through the list again and look at the predicted starters, and I have to populate the list here. And whoosh, there it is, just like magic. And okay, that was kind of a hokey special effect. Anyway, let's go. Hansi Flick then, well, we would call him a starter, the starting manager. And for goalkeepers, we have Manuel Neuer, Kevin Trapp, and Marc-Anthony ter Stegen. And we had nominated Neuer as the starter. However, you know, ter Stegen, as we said, had played 3 of the 13 games in the period that we looked at. He also started both September friendlies, and Neuer came back for the November game. Sorry, not September friendly, September Nations League game. And Neuer came back for the November game. But that shakes our confidence a little, but we're going to stick with it. But it does kind of show that ter Stegen is kind of the second string keeper there. Okay, on to central defenders. We have Nicolas Sula, Thilo Kehrer, Antonio Rudiger, Nico Schlotterbeck, Matthias Ginter, and the new candidate, or the new player added, Armel Bella-Kotchap. And in the previous podcast, we had nominated Sula and Rudiger as the starters. There had been a lot of players in and out, including in the recent games, where all of the players except Bella-Kotchap got a start. So it leaves us a little bit confused. But we're going to stick with Sula and Rudiger as the starters, but we're not fully confident. And, you know, we wouldn't be surprised if a couple of the other players got starts there. Okay, for left back, though, we had nominated, the candidates are David Raum and Christian Günther. who we were surprised was selected, and we had nominated Rome as the starter, and we were even more confident about this when we saw that he started all three recent games. So almost a certainty there. The right back is a bit less certain, Jonas Hoffman, but we'd have Lucas Klosterman, the other candidate, coming in more often, and sometimes central defender Kehrer moving over. However, because Hoffman also plays as a right attacking midfielder, we're pretty sure he's going to start in one position or the other there. So we'll put him as a starter. For defensive and central midfielders, we have Joshua Kimmich, Ilkay Gundogan, and Leon Goretzka. And the manager seemed to go through a lot of players to whittle it down to these three. And we're really torn between whether putting Kimmich and Gundogan as the two starters with Goretzka as kind of a backup, or whether to do what we're going to do, which I'll tell you here. So Kimmich always seems to start, so we're going to nominate him as a starter. Goretzka did play in that position quite a bit, in the, I think it was Euro Cup, maybe Euro Cup, or in the World Cup qualifiers. Anyway, there was a time where he was kind of the main starter. And we also noticed that he had been out with coronavirus, for part of this period, the recent period. So we wonder if he's still a consideration. So we're going to put Gundogan and Goretzka as kind of maybes, or maybe rotating starters, as something like that. But we do kind of favor Gundogan as the starter. Okay, left wingers and right wingers, we have none. The left and right backs play those positions. For left midfielders, we have right midfielder Leroy Sané, but he really does seem to own that position. So we're going to nominate him as a starter. The other candidate is Julian Brandt, but we don't see him as a starter. For right midfielders, we have Thomas Müller and Serge Gnabry. Both of them do kind of move around and play in different positions, but we kind of can't decide between them. And then we have Hoffman coming into the picture too. However, we are going to nominate them as both as starters, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Not necessarily starters in the right midfield position, but a starter somewhere on the field. So let me just come back to that. I mean, one of the reasons is that Müller plays as an attacking midfielder. So if he's not starting on the right, he might start as a central attacking midfielder. And actually, we did have Müller as a starter in the previous podcast. And we're beginning to see Musiala in the same light, because he's starting more and more. We don't quite think he's going to be a starter, but we'll put him as a sometime starter. I'm talking about, the attacking midfielders who I didn't introduce, Kai Havertz and Jamal Musiala. And we have Havertz as a sometime starter, but again, he may get more time. And what we're thinking here is Timo Werner being out of the cup. So we kind of think all of these players are going to see a little more action. And we think that, rather than starting with Moukoko in the position, that they'll sub Moukoko into a couple of games and see how he does. But in terms of starters, we think they're going to rely more on these experienced players. So, that's why we think Thomas Müller and Serge Gnabry will both be starters. And probably it'll give Kai Havertz and Jamal Musiala a better chance, although we do have those just as sometimes starters, coded as sometimes starters. So, yes, we're not going to put Youssoufa Moukoko even as a sometimes starter, because we think they'll try him out as a substitute. Okay, let us move on. And we're going to give some closing thoughts. And, rather than repeat the whole discussion we had in the team podcast about Germany's prospects, we're going to focus on this question. Does the selection change our opinion about Germany's chances? And the answer to that is no. even the loss of Timo Werner as a forward, we don't think it's a huge loss to them because they have the players to make it up. Actually, it is a bit surprising that they didn't have the forwards to make it up and kind of have to go to brand new players rather than having players on the bench that can take the position. But in a sense, they do, because we think the attacking midfielders can easily step into the forward role. So generally, the team is looking healthy, and we think the manager has come to some conclusions to make it a stable team. He experimented early on, and in the recent games, it was really just tweaking the team. So we don't think that changes their chances that we talked about in the team podcast. So again, we won't repeat everything we said there, and we'll just leave it at that. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this mediacast. So please keep an eye on us at soccerphiles.canada. And we have a website at soccerphiles.captivate.fm, and we're also available on YouTube. And in both of those places, you can check the show notes for links to our website and basically to navigate our stuff. We have playlists in YouTube, and you can navigate to other series that we've done. So we hope you do, and thank you for listening, and see you next time.